The second round of official talks between China and the United States have started in Anchorage, Alaska. Earlier, China's CPC Politburo member Yang Jiechi and State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi held a first round of talks with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. This is the first high-level strategic dialogue since U.S. President Joe Biden took office in January. So let's get more updates from this meeting. As we just reported, the first stage of this meeting has concluded, and it's quite crucial because this is the first meeting between the two sides since Biden took office. Actually, ties between the world's two largest economies are at their lowest in decades due to disagreements over many core issues. There are hopes for a reset in ties, but the opening remarks was marked by strong words exchanged by both sides. Representing China, a CPC Politburo member Yang Jiechi and State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken opened his remarks by saying China needed to return to a rules-based system. He criticized China for what he called economic coercion and for violating international norms. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the U.S. has been trying to suppress China's legitimate rights and interests in the past few years. Washington's moves have led to serious difficulties in bilateral ties and have harmed global stability and development. Chinese senior diplomat Yang Jiechi, in his speech, hit back at the U.S. groundless accusations of China's internal and foreign policies. He said such opening remarks by Blinken were intended to provoke conflict between the two sides. Yang said the State Secretary's words were not suitable for diplomatic protocol. He said China exercises proper democracy based on its own conditions and that China has consistently promoted shared values, including peace, development, equality, justice, and freedom. Yang Jiechi called for both sides to manage their differences properly and on a basis of mutual respect and cooperation. Now, for more on this ongoing talks, let's cross live to our correspondent Nathan King in Anchorage, Alaska, and our reporter Cui Huiyao in Beijing. Let me start with you, Nathan. So the second stage has started. What updates you've got from the first stage?
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's actually just got underway just a few minutes before we came on air here. The Chinese delegation coming back from the dinner break here in Alaska. It's about 8 o'clock local time. In fact, the first session overrun by about an hour and a bit. Talking is good, but as you said, it was a little bit frosty. In fact, one of the sources in the room said to me, super spicy was kind of the theme of the first hour or two of the meeting. And you've read out, obviously, some of the statements there from Yang Jiechi and also Wang Yi. Let me just read to you the Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement that's just come out. The Chinese side came to Alaska with its mindset on strategic dialogue, but the US side overran its time first and made unreasonable accusations. This is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement, which was not in line with diplomatic protocol. Therefore, China made a stern response, and that's from the Ministry of Affairs. And also, according to our team here, Wang Yi is stressing the importance of the phone call that has taken place previously between, obviously, Chinese President Xi Jinping and the new President Joe Biden, willing to exchange views with the US on the basis of mutual respect. So essentially what the Chinese position been here has been the accusations that we've heard from as Antony Blinken, the new US Secretary of State, has been on his tour of allies of East Asia in Japan and the Republic of Korea, and now he's back in Anchorage, is to basically come back and say, no, you're not right. We will always defend Chinese sovereignty, no interference in our internal affairs. And of course, I'm speaking about Hong Kong, Xinjiang and Taipei here. And obviously what sort of soured the mood a little bit before this was the decision by the State Department to sanction more Chinese and Hong Kong individuals under the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which was passed by the US Congress in the Trump administration over the national security law. And that list was expanded from 10 to 24 on the eve of this high-level dialogue. So obviously that led to partly the Chinese response. Now, however, they talked, and they talked for a long time, and when the journalists were out of the room, and social media. They talked and they went for dinner and they're back here as well. We're expecting another 2-hour session, and then of course tonight they will go back to their respective hotels and come here Friday morning. I know it's already Friday morning where you are, but Friday morning here, Alaska, Anchorage time, and do another session as well. Now, the big question is, obviously we know where the red lines are for China. They have been set out for many, many years. Where are the red lines when it comes to the US, and is there any areas for cooperation? Alaska is a frigid state suffering from climate change. That's one of them. Obviously, we want to know the state of where trade is, those $350 billion worth of Chinese goods that are still tariffed after the Trump administration has left office, but also cooperation, for future use and current COVID-19, etc. There are areas of cooperation, but obviously going in, there has been quite a bit of rhetoric. There's been some actions from Washington side, and what you saw in the first session with China essentially pushing back and stating its red lines, and the fact that both sides know where they are now, I presume, is the time for a granular discussion on the way forward.
So, Nathan, having said that, what would you say is the US approach to this meeting so far? And having mentioned so many dramatic moments during the first stage, do you think the US will slightly change its approach, maybe?
Well, there's a phrase in America that all politics are local, domestic. Basically, as we know, in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, the rhetoric against China was ramped up. COVID-19, I don't need to go into the finger pointing and the words that were used by the Trump administration, and public polling had put negative views on China. The incoming Biden administration, I think what they're trying to do is appear as muscular. They disagree with the Trump policy in many respects. They want to bring on allies, hence the trip to Japan and the Republic of Korea before coming here to Anchorage, but it's very good that they're speaking directly to top Chinese diplomats within the first 100 days of the Biden administration. I think it's a question of wait and see. Every administration comes in and conducts a review of policy. And there are areas where, the US has had a blind spot. I'm thinking about the DPRK, for example. I know that the troubles in Myanmar, the US and China could work on. There are all these hotspots where they could work on, as well as the big global challenges like climate change. So we'll have to wait and see. Whenever you go into talks, there's always a bit of posturing from each side about what happens. The fact that they are here, they're talking, both sides are very experienced diplomats, and it'll be very interesting to see. The talks overran in the first session. That's not a bad sign. They'll probably overrun in the second session on Friday too.
Well, Nathan King then. Now let's go to our reporter Cui Huiyao in Beijing. Huiyao, what's the Chinese reaction so far?
Well, very dramatic development in the first session of the meeting. Many people did not see that coming. And statements just came out of the Chinese delegation less than an hour ago, blamed the U.S. for, quote, stirring up conflict and unjustifiably attacking China's domestic and foreign policies. China says this is not the way you treat your guests, and certainly is not in line with diplomatic etiquette. Now, regarding bilateral cooperation coming into this meeting, many pundits say there will be areas of cooperation for both sides. And China's senior diplomat Yang Jiechi acknowledged today there are areas for two sides to work together, such as on climate change, coronavirus pandemic, and economic recovery. Those are in the interest of both countries. But having said that, Yang said the prerequisite for cooperation is that the U.S. must change its zero-sum mentality towards China. For instance, stop abusing the concept of national security as it interferes with China's the bilateral trade. China is also firmly against the U.S. interfering with China's internal affairs. For example, Yang said China is not going to buy what he calls the condescending approach from the U.S. He said the history has proven and will prove that those attempts to stifle China's growth will only hurt the countries themselves. And the Communist Party Foreign Affairs chief also said the U.S. should mind its own business and stop pointing fingers at China's human rights and democracy. The reason is obvious. China has its own development path, and both countries have their own democratic systems. So the standards, values, and rules set by the U.S. are not universal, and those attempts to change China's systems is what he calls feudal. And the statement also quoted the U.S. delegation's opening remarks, in which the U.S. side accused China of using economic coercions on some other nations. And on that particular point, China's State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi fired back, pointed out it's the U.S. that should not listen to only one side, and neither should it give unprincipled protection to its allies for their wrong words and deeds. And those acts are certainly not conducive for healthy international relations, he says. Now, both countries' leaders have agreed on a non-confrontational and non-conflict bilateral relations. We know that because Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden had their first phone call on the eve of Chinese New Year. So at today's first session, both sides, Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi, urged both sides to make efforts to set bilateral ties back on track. So, Pendant, as you can see, this is perhaps even more fiery and confrontational than most pundits have expected ahead of the meeting. And will both sides walk away this meeting with more understanding of each other, like what Chinese ambassador to the U.S. Cui Tiankai said during his interview with China Media Group? Well, from China's standpoint, that would require more efforts from the U.S. side. That's all from me. Back to you.
Thank you very much, our reporter Cui Hiao in Beijing. For more insights into this crucial meeting, we're joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Victor Gao, Chair Professor at Suzhou University, and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney in New Orleans. He's a professor of politics at East China Normal University. Let me start with you, Professor Gao. Both our reporters earlier have detailed this heated exchange during the opening remarks of the first session in this round of talks. So let me refer you to a statement from Chinese Foreign Ministry, which was released just about 1 hour ago. It said the United States at first was seriously over time in its opening remarks, then groundlessly attacked China's domestic and foreign policy. This is a breach of diplomatic protocol. What's your reading into this? Why the United States chose to start meeting with such a manner?
Well, first of all, the China-U.S. discussions taking place in Alaska for the first day is truly very dramatic, and it keeps the whole world in suspense. I think the United States probably miscalculated. They wanted to walk into the meeting with China from a position of so-called strength, and Mr. Yang Jiechi categorically rejected that, saying the United States has no qualification to talk to China from a position of strength. So there are lots of issues to be ironed out between China and the United States, and I think the fact that they are talking with each other is a good sign. This gives hope to people like me who want to see more steady progress of China-U.S. relations going forward. I hope that behind-the-door meetings between the two sides, the very seasoned and very senior diplomats of China and the United States could have been proceeding more carefully, more prudently, and the result, which eventually will be disclosed, will be more heartening rather than heartbreaking.
Well, Professor Mahoney, do you think the U.S. choice of starting this meeting in such an aggressive and condescending manner can work during this meeting and even for future diplomatic ties between the two countries? Because let me refer you to another statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. During the meeting, Yang Jiechi said most of the countries in the world don't reckon that the U.S. values are international values, and they don't reckon what the United States said is international discourse. What's your reading into this?
I largely agree with Professor Gao on the point. I do think the U.S. Came in with the intent to posture quite a bit. I think this is really playing to domestic media. I do think that we are having probably much more sober, realistic conversations going on. As Victor indicated, they likely are. I don't think we would see the two top diplomats from China traveling to Anchorage unless there were some guarantees that there was going to be some positive progressive movement made. Whether or not all of that's going to be revealed in the near term remains to be seen. But I'm optimistic. I think what we're seeing is a little frustration and posturing on both sides. But I think that the air needs to be cleared, and then we'll move forward.
And we'll talk about the positive aspects later in this discussion, but let's get back to the U.S. agenda. Do you think the United States is trying to push many countries, developing countries, developed countries, to choose sides between United States and China. Do you think this will pressure those countries' diplomatic thinking? For example, Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in an interview earlier that the tensions between the world's two major powers, China and United States, is a dilemma for many countries. Let's take a listen.
I mean, it is not possible for us to choose one or the other because we have very intense and extensive ties with both the US and with China, economic as well as in other areas. And so too do many other countries in the world. So I don't think this is a dilemma only to Singapore. It's a problem for many countries in the world, which is why we are all hoping and encouraging the two large powers to think very carefully before embarking on deciding that the other one is an adversary and one which has to be kept down, if not put down.
So, Professor Mahoney, do you think that can represent the thinking of most countries in the world? If that's the case, do you think the United States is moving against this trend?
Well, Singapore is somewhat unique, of course. Few countries straddle U.S.-China relations as much as Singapore does. But many do, in fact, share that sentiment. They want to have positive relations with both sides. They can't afford to alienate one or the other. And they resent being pushed to choose, particularly when many are facing much graver issues that beg good ties and cooperation over competition.
Professor Gao, earlier you mentioned that the tensions in China-US ties has kept the world in suspense. So having this meeting itself could be an opportunity for the two countries to talk about some core issues at hand. So what do you think could be some areas for possible cooperation?
I truly believe that this Alaska meeting will not be the last meeting between China and the United States at the highest level. There will be more to come, and we need to have reason to believe that the more such discussions and talks there are between China and the United States, hopefully there will be better understanding and better sizing up of what each other represents or stands for. And this actually will give hope to mankind as a large, because no one in the world can afford to have a really traumatic relations between China and the United States on the verge of complete breakdown, because it will not be in anyone's interest. And China and the United States actually have many areas of cooperation on the international side. For example, climate change, joint effort in fighting off the pandemic, and global governance in many areas, debt relief for many developing countries, etc. I think the more China and the United States cooperate to the extent possible, the better will be for peace and stability in the world. On the bilateral side, there are also many areas that China and the United States can cooperate. Why? Because I truly believe the Chinese people and the American people are not enemies against each other, and we lose more if we get more and more alienated from each other. No one, either China or the United States, can benefit from greater deterioration in bilateral relations. We need all the wisdom and courage and vision to stand firm, to steer a
That's
steady
right,
course.
Professor. So you earlier explained the problem of can, but what about the problem of how? Because as we just mentioned, ties are already at decades low.
We can start with the easier thing. For example, China could allow the United States to restore its Consulate General in Chengdu on the condition that the American side allow Chinese Consulate General in Houston to be restored. China can restore more normal working atmosphere for American journalists in China on the condition that the United States government do the same thing for Chinese journalists operating in the United States. Now, with these small steps going forward, I think they can lead to greater ties for the positive development of China-US relations. We do not want to make a big leap forward across a very divided China and the United States in many areas. Smaller steps going forward, one at a time, can pave the way for greater transformation of China-US relations for the better.
Well, Professor Mahoney, what do you make of Professor Gao's thoughts on those small steps forward? Do you think they're possible in the context of U.S. domestic policies, which has been intoxicated by the Trump legacy. And even in diplomacy, Trump has set a quite vicious bar for the Biden administration. Do you think it will be very difficult for Biden to make some actual changes?
I think what we'll see most likely in the beginning will be some cooperation on climate change as well as the pandemic. I think Victor's right about the need to resolve the consulate dispute and the journalist dispute and a few others, but I think those are probably further down the road. I think what we're going to see out of this meeting tomorrow is going to be a bit more tough language, a few notes of optimism, and then indications that there'll be additional meetings between lower level officials planned to work through some details. But make no mistake, despite the spin, there's a lot of heavy lifting going on in Anchorage right now, and eventually we should expect good things to emerge on multiple fronts, not just climate change or the pandemic, but also security, non-proliferation. And really, I think both sides are really interested in resolving this trade war sooner rather than later. I think the only thing that's really limiting this resolution at this point is the domestic politics in the U.S. That's putting pressure on Biden, and he's going to have to walk a fine line there.
So those are expectations. Tell us a little bit more about the positive aspects you mentioned earlier. What specific areas are you talking about?
Well, again, I think we'll definitely see some shared statements, positive statements on climate change and the pandemic. I think in terms of where we're seeing Beijing now and Washington now with the new administration, they're quite close on these two issues in principle. So I think those are the easy, low-hanging fruit. I do think that we are looking at a number of compelling circumstances with the difficult situation that the U.S. is facing economically, the high-risk stimulus plan, as well as my conviction is that the stimulus plan to work, the U.S. really needs a lot of cooperation from China economically. So that pressure is manifold and building day by day. There are a lot of businesses putting a lot of pressure on Biden to resolve this. There are a lot of people in Anchorage and Alaska pressuring this. So that's coming, I think, mid-year at the latest, perhaps a little later. But again, I think that once the economy issues are starting to be resolved, all other things will start to fall in place.
So, Professor Gao, we've talked a lot about specific issues between China and the United States. Let's talk a little bit more about global implications of this very meeting, which is the first since Biden took office.
Well, I think China and the United States each need to live and let live for these two great countries. There is no reason that China and the United States are destined to be enemies or to have a war against each other. And I think we need to keep faith. We need to really, truly believe that the American people and the Chinese people are destined to remain friends and partners rather than enemies, because this is the megatrend for mankind as a whole. We need to be positive about the future of China-US relations, despite of any or all difficulties.
Thank you very much, Professor Victor Gao and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney there. You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. Coming up, local media in Myanmar are reporting a deadly attack on a military base near Yangon. And in the United States, concerns over anti-Asian hate crimes grow as the investigation into Tuesday's Atlanta shootings continues.
China and U.S. officials meet for the first time under the Biden administration, and CGTN is there covering the event.
Could they lead to a thaw in U.S.-China relations?
Special coverage continues from Anchorage, Alaska. Stay with CGTN and follow us online. See the difference.